I'm just going to get started, and I thought what I would do is present this as though I'm talking to a group of people who are interested in becoming speech pathologists or who have a little bit of a background in aphasia but want to know a little bit more about it. I'm not going to be presenting a whole bunch of academic details. It's mostly going to be observations about aphasia and a little story about how our Aphasia Friendly Canada campaign is going to change the world for people with aphasia. So what is aphasia? I'm sure that most of you know that aphasia is a language disorder. It's a communication disorder that arises from damage to part of the brain. Mostly that damage comes from an area called Broca's area, which coincidentally leads to something called Broca's aphasia, or Wernicke's area, which is a little bit further back on the left side. Both of these areas tend to be on the left side for most people who have aphasia. The left side is the side with damage, and that translates into right side paralysis in some cases. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And the left side of the brain, for the vast majority of people, also controls language. A subset of people who are left-handed have language on the right side of the brain. But most people, it's the left side. So these two areas are the areas that are thought to be the primary language areas, and damage to either one of these areas will lead to aphasia. And I'm sure that most of you have learned that Broca's area leads to problems. If you have damage in Broca's area, that leads to problems producing language. Whereas in Wernicke's area, that's more related to problems receiving language or understanding language. So that's the first thing that you learn as a student about aphasia, that there's a couple of different kinds and they're associated with these different areas of the brain. The truth is that this association is not as clear-cut as most textbooks say, and that you can have damage to the area known as Broca's area without having Broca's aphasia. And similarly, you can have damage to Wernicke's area without having what's known as Wernicke's aphasia. That's one thing. Another thing that you typically learn is that the bigger the damage, the bigger the area of damage, the more impaired someone will be. That's sometimes the case, but it's not always the case. And you can have people who have damage to just a small part of the brain, and that can lead to what's known as global aphasia. So aphasia is, at the most general level, a language problem. People with aphasia have problems either producing or understanding language, and in some cases they have problems with both the production and the comprehension of language. Typically, this problem arises from stroke. So most of the people that you will meet with aphasia have had a stroke, or sometimes brain tumors will lead to aphasia. But there are other causes of language disorders that include dementia, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of dementias that can lead to some kind of word finding problem. And it ends up that if you think of all of the people with some kind of communication disorder, in Canada, there's between 165 and 384,000 people that are currently living with some form of aphasia. And those are like brain damage related aphasia. When you include things like autism, Parkinson's, or dementias where the primary initial symptom is a language disorder, these numbers become a lot higher. So aphasia is very, very common. It's a lot more common than multiple sclerosis, but people don't know what aphasia is, and that's something that Julie is going to be talking about when she takes over from me. alarmingly, so there's already a lot of people in Canada with aphasia. There is going to be a lot more people in Canada with aphasia because people with COVID, so-called long haulers, or people with COVID, the vast majority of them have demonstrated some kind of word finding difficulties, and some of them have experienced even more severe aphasia symptoms. So these are people who've had COVID, and they continue to have the symptoms long after the virus has left the body. So because of this, the COVID is increasing the number of people with aphasia, and also because there's some kind of blood and clotting disorders associated not with the vaccine, but with COVID itself, that increases the likelihood of stroke. So there's going to be more people with aphasia as a result of actually having COVID-19. So the numbers will also increase there. And as we all know, the population of people in Canada is getting older, and as you get older, the chances of stroke increase. So altogether, there's aphasia is very, very common, and it will be increasingly common. The range of aphasia varies from people who have the odd word finding difficulty to people who can't talk at all. And I would say that the vast majority of people with aphasia, although the lack of communication is the most problematic or the most salient symptom, the biggest problem that most people with aphasia face is loneliness. So if I were to ask you right now, how would you feel if you were to be paralyzed? If you were to be in an accident and be paralyzed? Every one of you, I would bet, would say, I would be devastated, I would be unhappy, the rest of my life would be destroyed, I would spend the rest of my life miserable. But in fact, if you ask people after they've been paralyzed, if you ask people to rate the quality of life, of their lives, most people who are in a wheelchair after an accident feel that they're about average, they have about average happiness. So we can imagine that we would be devastated by the loss of the ability to move, and I don't mean to make light of it, but in the end, people adapt to that. Of 75 different health disorders, people with aphasia are the people who are most likely to say that they have very bad quality of life. So people with aphasia are kind of burdened by their lack of ability to communicate, and their ability to socialize with other people is lost. Most of them have lost their employment, they've lost their autonomy, they've lost their friends, so the circle of people who they communicate with has shrunk substantially. And a lot of times they've had to give up their hobbies because maybe they have paralysis or the hobbies involve some kind of communication. So the quality of life for people with aphasia is not good. People with aphasia tend to be depressed. And for people with severe aphasia, this depression is hard to address because they can't it's not easy for them to go to see a clinician for any kind of therapy, because there aren't very many clinicians that are trained to work with people who can't, easily communicate. This is a big problem in the psychology field, and I think that eventually people will address it, but right now there's no training specifically for people to give clinical help to somebody with aphasia. So how do we address these problems? If you're a speech pathologist or somebody that's interested in helping people with aphasia, you can think about a couple of different ways that you can help. So the treatment can involve either the person or the environment. So if you think of the medical model of disorders, the idea is that you fix the person. You fix the person to address the problem. So a good example of how this doesn't always work is there's Alexander Graham Bell spent his entire life trying to help deaf people talk. And I mean, he's famous for the telephone, but his big contributions were around trying to get deaf people to talk. And there's a lot of people in the deaf community that would say that that caused more harm than good, and that maybe treating the person wasn't the right way to go there. But let's say you do want to treat the person. You've got somebody with aphasia that comes in to see you as a speech pathologist. How do you address the problems that this person is facing? You can address the deficit, and this is when you think about any kind of therapy, this is generally what people think of. So somebody with aphasia who has problems speaking, so producing language, you would go to that person and you would say, okay, let's rehearse, let's go over the sounds that letters make. Let's pull these sounds together to create words. So you start with a kind of a phonological approach. Now, for some people that works. If the aphasia is not really severe, there's a possibility that addressing the deficit and working towards fixing it is the answer. And a lot of people with aphasia end up being, you know, fine. People with aphasia sometimes recover, and they can recover with help addressing the deficit. For a lot of the people that I've seen, addressing the deficit is not the solution. They have lost the ability to produce words, and that ability is essentially gone forever. So the idea of addressing the problem by treating the deficit won't work for these people. And instead, it's important to think about how you can emphasize the strengths or the capacity to communicate that people still have. So I can tell you from personal experience that this is not, if your loved one had a stroke and became aphasic, this is not the kind of information that people get. This is not the kind of information that family members get. They don't get, okay, your loved one can no longer speak, but they can still write, or they can still mime, or they can still sing. So there are a lot of processes that remain intact in some people with aphasia. And if the loved one of someone with aphasia were to come to you as a speech pathologist, you would give them a lot of support just by saying, here's what your loved one can do, and let's work with that. So I'll tell you, every person with aphasia that I have met, and I've met a lot of people with aphasia, but everyone that I have met retains the ability to swear. So, and they can swear with different intonations, so you can get an idea of what's going on when they're talking just from the intonation. So intonation sometimes is preserved. A lot of people, I know a global aphasic, so someone who has problems with some kind of a little bit of problem with comprehension and almost mute, can only say 4 or 5 words, but can write. And he can write proper nouns and dates. So it's important for him to carry around a pad and for people to take the time to listen to read what he's writing. So you're playing to the person's strengths. There are other people who can mime really well, but a lot of people can't. And I've been thinking lately, I have not, maybe Julia will have had a different experience or seen someone different, or maybe someone in the audience has, but I've not come across anyone who draws as a form of communication. So that possibility exists, and maybe Julia will be able to say that she's seen that, but I haven't, and I just think that that's a little on the weird side. But anyway, so you can play with you can work with the person to address the deficit, or you can work with the person to to capitalize on their existing strengths and help them communicate. So in this way, you're addressing aphasia by working with the person to change their communication styles, either to strengthen or to change the way they communicate with the outside world. And this is what speech pathologists do. And it's often a really long haul for these people. But being lonely is the most difficult aspect of aphasia. If you were to ask people, it's the loneliness that's the worst part. And there have been a lot of studies recently that have said that loneliness is akin to smoking or obesity or physical inactivity with respect to, you know, not the quality of life, but the length of life. So people with who had heart issues, in a survey with people with heart issues, it was discovered that loneliness predicted a 64% higher mortality rate for heart attack victims than people who weren't lonely. So people who have aphasia are among the loneliest people in the world, I think, and fixing the person is not going to solve that problem. So the problem is a little bit more than the lack of communication abilities. It's a lot to do with the environment. So this is where the Aphasia Friendly Canada campaign comes in. Our goal, we've observed this, that people with aphasia are lonely, and we're trying to make an effort to change that by treating the environment. And before I hand it over to Julia, I'll tell you a little story about this. This is what originally got me thinking about this ages ago. My sister and I were on a bicycle tour of England, and we stopped at a hotel, and they had a sign on the door, and the door said aphasia friendly. So I went in and asked at the front desk, what does that mean? And the guy at the front desk didn't know, but he said he would ask his manager. So he called his manager out, and the manager said he wasn't sure, but he thought it meant that you could breastfeed there. So I learned a couple of things from that. First of all, I learned that you know, there had been efforts to get businesses to become aphasia friendly, but I also learned that there were problems with making sure that that message remained consistent. So our goal is to get businesses to become aphasia friendly and to keep them aphasia friendly. So 5 years from now, nobody's going to be asking at our local Tim Hortons, what does that sign mean? And you know, the person at the front won't say, oh, you can breastfeed here. So now I'm going to hand it over to Julia, who's going to give you ideas. So she's going to give a little training session as though you were coming to one of the Aphasia Friendly Business Campaign sessions. So Julia, you just tell me when I should change the slides.
Okay, will do. So yeah, like Lori said, we don't want to put the burden on people with aphasia to have to take on the responsibility of communicating with others. We want to change that environment so it's easier for them. And we often think of accessibility in terms of physical access. So when someone is in a wheelchair and is trying to get into a building, we build a ramp, right? People with aphasia can enter that building sometimes, and they can't access the customer service providers, the people within the business, because there are no communication ramps. So what we are doing with Aphasia Friendly Canada is really training employees and business owners and people like yourselves to use these communication ramps so that people with aphasia can access the community. And so I'm going to talk about some supportive communication strategies. And so We can kind of group these strategies into 3 different categories. And the first one is good questioning. And I'm going to go into more details with these, but I'll give a brief overview. And so when we're asking and interacting with someone with aphasia, we really want to actively consider the words that we're choosing and how we're phrasing the questions that we're asking in this conversation. So we want to be specific, we want to enunciate, and we want to be flexible and be able to reframe questions if the comprehension isn't necessarily connecting. So the second the kind of overview of the strategies is the second one is providing alternative ways to answer, okay? And so there are so many different ways to communicate that don't involve verbal communication. So like Lori was mentioning, there's miming, there's singing, there's swearing, and I also haven't seen anyone who can draw what they're trying to communicate, but the Aphasia Institute does recommend trying it out, so people may have that ability. And then the third kind of strategy that we're going to go over is verifying what is being said in this conversation. And so the main thing to keep in mind is that this conversation that you're having with this person with aphasia is a new experience for you, and it might be new for the person with aphasia too. And you want to create a space where it's comfortable and encouraging for both of you to continually ask these good questions and be creative and really be able to communicate. So with that, I will move forward in the slideshow. And we'll go into more depth here about good questioning. And so, like I mentioned, we really want to consider our words. We actively want to think about the questions we're asking. And so there are 2 different types of questions. The first are open-ended. So these are general, vague questions that we typically ask. So how can I help you? What would you like? So there's a lot of different ways to respond to these. And if you're noticing that the person that you're asking these open-ended questions to is having difficulty answering these questions, consider reframing your questions to closed-ended questions. And so these are the easiest types of questions to answer because they're specific and they're directed questions that can be answered with a yes or no answer. So reframing that, how can I help you, to a closed-ended question would be something like, would you like some help? Would you like to place an order? So it's a closed-ended question that can be answered with a yes or no, and or they could indicate that you're on the wrong track entirely, but it really gets that communication started, and that conversation is that bridge is built by creating a space for them to answer. And you might need to ask several questions in a row. Take your time, get one answer before you move on to the next question. And make sure that you're allowing time for the person with aphasia to answer. So after you ask the question, they might need a second or 2 to process the question, think of a response, and then provide you a response. So a saying is, once you've waited 10 seconds, wait 10 seconds more, and then proceed with the question. So making sure that there's a lot of time to answer these questions. So we'll move forward on the slideshow. And that brings us to alternative ways, providing alternative methods to communicate rather than just verbal communication. So there's pictures, there's gesturing and miming, pointing, trying to draw your word or message, of course, just really being creative with your communication. Some people, like Lori mentioned, are able to sing their message. Give them that space. Say, you might be able to sing your answer. I'm open and willing to hear that. And so you might have visual aids with you, and if you don't, you can always be creative. Most of us have phones on us. You can pull up pictures of things, just really kind of using your resources that are around you to create alternative ways. And You might have to cover choices. So we provide some tools once we've completed a training, or they're actually available for download if you're interested. And sometimes you might actually have to cover some options up. So let's say you're asking for somebody's phone number and you have this alphabet card with phone numbers on it. You might want to cover up the alphabet letters so that just the numbers are displayed. And so just to reiterate, we just really want you to be creative, open-minded, and using your resources to facilitate these conversations. And one last note on that is combining technique, so like gesturing and showing a visual aid. It actually just increases the comprehension. So try and use as many different alternative methods as you can, in your conversation. So with that, I'll get you to switch the slide. Okay, perfect. So here we are. Another way of alternative communication is writing, providing the person with aphasia a piece of paper to write with. So Lori mentioned someone that loved writing and was still able to write even though their expressive communication was limited. And so keeping that in the back of your mind, you want to encourage writing, so offering a piece of paper. And why we suggest a blank piece of paper is because of that, like Lori was mentioning, that paralysis that sometimes occurs with stroke. It often occurs in the right side of the body, and most people write with their right hand. So their writing is limited, and we don't want lined paper to constrain how they have to write. So blank paper just creates an open space for them to not have lined paper and those constraints of the line. When you are writing to try and communicate a message, we want to use large block letters just for clarity in communicating. And while you're writing, you want a keyword. So a lot of times we use excess words in our sentences. And so an example might be like, where is the car? To keyword that, you could just write car with a question mark. So we really just want to be as concise and clear as we can in our questioning, so that there's less kind of information to process, and our points are just as clear and concise as they can be. When we're typing, or if you are creating a document for someone that has aphasia, the Arial font is actually the most accessible. And so there's a lot of literature on that. So straying away from our traditional Times New Roman, if you're trying to make something more aphasia friendly, it's actually Arial font that we would recommend using. And so moving forward with different ways of communicating. Everything is virtual because of the pandemic, and so a lot of our communication has been moved to phones and these Zoom platforms and team platforms. So while communicating on the phone with someone with aphasia or any kind of communication barrier, it is definitely more challenging because we don't have the availability of using our reading body language, using gestures, all those kind of alternative strategies. But you can use some strategies still while you are communicating with someone on the phone. You can still use those close-ended questions that can be answered with a yes or no answer. And you can still certainly use those keywording. So just saying the most important points to your question. Something else that speech pathologists and healthcare professionals have been trying out is indicating that the person with aphasia, if they have an iPhone or any kind of phone really, you could encourage them to press the 0 key one time to indicate that they're responding a yes answer, or they could press the 0 key or really any other button 2 times to communicate that the answer to your question is a no. And so this is a technique that you would certainly want to check, do like a comprehension check with the person on the other line. And you would want to practice to ensure that their responding of the yes or no is indeed accurate. So to practice this technique, you could, for example, just explain the process of pressing 1 the key once for yes, the key twice for no. And then to practice that, you could say, is your name Julia? And then you would wait to hear if it was a correct yes or no, and then continue to proceed with your conversation. So definitely it is more challenging to communicate on the phone, but there are definitely techniques that you can use to make this conversation more effective. And so we'll move forward on the slideshow. And then this last piece is kind of straightforward. We really want to verify what the person with aphasia is saying. We never want to assume that we understand without thinking in our minds. Did I understand what they were saying? Did they understand what I was saying? And we don't want to pretend. So if you find that you're at a crossroads in the conversation where you're really not sure what is being communicated, we want to circle back and go back to our close-ended questions and say, is this what I'm hearing? Yes or no? And then that's just a nice verification to make sure that everybody's on the same page and everything is good in this conversation. And so that's just an important piece while we're ending the conversation, is to make sure, and not even just ending, throughout the conversation, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And with that, I think moving forward on the slideshow, I think that is where Lori will come back in and talk about us and you and everyone watching, and how we're going to inspire a more aphasia-friendly Canada.
Okay, thanks, Julia. So I'll say now that you just had an abbreviated version of what Julia would do if she were to go into a company, let's say Tim Hortons. If she's met with people from a bunch of different Tim Hortons, and she's given this kind of a lesson to them. That lesson also includes something like a bit of a workshop where she says to people, tell the person next to you without using any words that you had to go to the garage this weekend to get a new alternator in your car. Imagine how hard that would be if you didn't have the words to say that, if you had to come up with another way to bring that up. So I'll give you an example of my brother. As you learned at the beginning, my brother has aphasia, and he used to call me on the phone. Now he's got a smartphone and he can send photographs and texts and things, and that's made an enormous difference. But before, he used to just call me on a landline and then want to talk to me. He's got 2 daughters, and if he was talking about one of his daughters, he would go, oh, in this little childish, girly voice. And then I would know, okay, you're talking about one of your daughters. And then I would kind of go from there and say, is it this daughter? And he would say no. And I would say, okay, it's this daughter. And then we would start the conversation that way. Or he would go, rah, 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 and I knew that meant he was talking about his ex-wife. So there were these kind of cues that I kind of got listening to him talk, but it was a long haul. And it's really difficult to talk to somebody over the phone if they don't have words. So smartphones have made a huge difference there. One thing that we don't want, and that that Julia said at the end, was we don't want to have businesses pretend that they are understanding what people with aphasia are wanting without actually understanding. And one of the issues that most people with aphasia find really trying is that people talk baby talk to them, or somehow treat them as though they're, cognitively impaired. Most people with aphasia they're cognitively fine. They take longer to communicate and they need a little bit more help, but they know what they want, and they certainly do not want to be spoken to like babies. So I have heard even experienced speech pathologists speak to people with aphasia as though they were childlike. So that's something to work against. You don't want to be one of those people. So, so what Julia has just given you is a kind of a overview of what you would learn if you were in one of the businesses where we went into to say, here's how to become aphasia friendly. In addition to that lesson and the workshop, the you know, telling your partner that you need a new alternator, we also provide worksheets and booklets for people. So let's say we went to a Shoppers Drug Mart, we would have pictures of the things that the people might want, and then they could leaf through this little booklet and point to something. We've developed abbreviated menus for Tim Hortons. We have little keychains, little keychain tags that have the yes, no, or wrong track, alphabets, things like that. So we have different resources that we give these businesses in addition to the training. And we ask that they put the aphasia friendly sign on their business when they've finished the training, and that people with aphasia know that they can go there. We also have a link on our website where if you have aphasia, you could go to this link and there's a map of all of the places that have been trained to become aphasia friendly. So ultimately, our goal is to have these businesses across Canada. We're working with the March of Dimes now to spread out this training. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is have businesses across Canada become aphasia friendly, and that people with aphasia can go into, let's say, Tim Hortons and order a coffee knowing that there's somebody there who's been trained to help them. I think this is probably the best way to get rid of the loneliness, or at least partially address the loneliness that people with aphasia face. So our goal when we started out, and our goal still, is to change the world. We want to change the environment. We're not treating the person, we're treating the environment. We want to change the world, and we want to make it a better place for people with aphasia. So the lesson that we learned from this is you got to make sure that the world wants to change. And one of the things we found is that it's not always easy to sell. So we're doing this for free. We're giving the lessons for free. We're creating the workbooks for free. We're doing everything for free, and all the businesses have to do is say that they want to do it. One of the downsides of this is that not every business is interested, and this has been kind of disheartening for us. Most businesses will say they're interested, but maybe they don't want to take the time or whatever. So Julie is now working on an online version where people can take the training at their own speed, and I think this is going to make a big difference. But one thing that we have in our favor to make sure that the world does want to change is that the AODA is now making it mandatory that these non-visible disabilities are addressed in the same way that, let's say, you have to have a wheelchair ramp if you have, people coming into your shop. Pretty soon, it's going to be illegal for people not to be able to accommodate people with communication disorders. Another good thing about this, in addition to the fact that we'll soon have law on our side, is that everything that Julia has told you about how to talk to somebody with aphasia is also helpful if you imagine that you're talking to somebody who doesn't have your language, let's say English as a first language. So in the Niagara region, there's a lot of tourism, and there's a lot of people coming that don't have one of our languages as their own, and you would have to maybe deal with them in their own language. The tricks that Julia gave you, the tips that Julia gave you, many of them translate to working with people who don't have your languages there. So there's a lot of benefits to becoming aphasia friendly that extend beyond aphasia. So if anybody's interested in joining the Aphasia Friendly Brigade, we welcome people. And I'm gonna turn it back to you guys now for questions.